Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start by thanking the organisers of the conference for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. It is slightly disconcerting to be stuck in a dark room talking to a camera, so if I look a little bit uncomfortable, you'll have to excuse me. But that's probably enough about me, and I should probably get on with the talk. The Defence Department has had a long history of engagement within the Pacific and Timor Leste. In recent times, in line with government policy, the nature of that engagement has changed, with greater focus on creating security partnerships to address mutual security outcomes. As a security partner, we are looking to create real value in our relationship. We create that value by focusing on our partners' security priorities and by being willing to explore areas of cooperation we have not previously considered. One area that hasn't traditionally been a focus of the Defence Cooperation Program is the elements of air power. That doesn't mean that ADF air power has been absent in the region, but it has been primarily focused on delivering specific operational effects during times of need, rather than being an area of focus for our security partnerships. Today, I want to discuss a potential roadmap for greater ADF air power presence within the Defence Cooperation Program. I have purposely not used Air Force because multiple elements of the ADF operate air power, and they could all be key contributors to this proposal. To be effective security partners with Pacific nations, we need to be adding value to the relationships by making meaningful contributions to their capacity to respond to their identified security needs. While we should never fall into the trap of presuming we understand individual security needs, which you can only really get through having meaningful personal dialogue, we are lucky that regional architectures such as the Pacific Island Forum do give us a strong understanding of regional security priorities. In 2018, the Pacific region spoke with one voice on security priorities when the Pacific Islands Forum issued the Boy Declaration on Regional Security, which identified an expanded concept of security priorities for the region that included human security, environment and resource security, transnational crime, and cybersecurity. This statement is important not only because of the priorities it identifies, but because it also highlights the desire of the Pacific leaders to view security as a wider regional challenge that they need to address through a coordinated strategy and in partnership with one another. While the leaders within our region would also recognise the importance of traditional elements of security, the Boy Declaration makes it clear that some aspects of security within the Pacific can only be treated effectively if the region tackles them as a coherent whole. This agreement, that some aspects of security within the Pacific are best treated through a coordinated regional approach, is important and something I'll return to later. While the Boy Declaration provides us with a good understanding of regional security priorities, that is really only half of the equation. In seeking to support the region in achieving their security outcomes, it's also important to understand those factors that limit and shape any potential response. In the most practical of terms, the majority of Pacific nations don't have the resources available to government to effectively treat the scale and wide scope of their security challenges. 75% of Pacific nations have a GDP of $1 billion or less. And like all nations, the governments within the Pacific region have to balance how much of their available resources they spend on mitigating security issues, when they also have a vast array of development needs. A lack of available financing isn't the only resource shortfall they are experiencing, with limited people resources also reducing their ability to address the full scope of security challenges. 80% of Pacific nations have a population of less than 1 million, and 50% of them have a population of less than 200,000. This lack of scale in both economy and available workforce restricts many nations' ability to apply resources within the security sector. And when it comes to their geography, the problem of scale is actually in reverse. Perhaps the best way to demonstrate the challenge geography creates is to provide an example. The Federated States of Micronesia have a population of 103,000, which is significantly less than 1% of Australia's population. They have a GDP of approximately 340 million, which is once again significantly less than 1% of Australia's. Yet, they have an EEZ, which is the 14th largest in the world, at almost 3 million square kilometres, which is 35% of Australia's EEZ. This disproportionality between resources available and the areas of geographic responsibility are the norm within the Pacific, with 7 Pacific nations figuring in the world's largest top 25 EEZs. It is also important to remember that most of the Pacific nations are archipelagic in nature, with many of them having populated islands dispersed over great distances and being serviced primarily by maritime assets only. For example, the Solomon Islands is made up of 6 major islands and over 900 smaller islands. The ability for national governments to achieve security outcomes over these vast distances and dispersed features tends to also be hampered by a lack of transport infrastructure and effective communication links, both voice and data. While Australia may not share the same challenges in resource availability, we are very familiar with the limitations created by geography. We share many of the same dispersion and distance challenges that our Pacific partners face. It is by no means simple for our country to generate security effects over such a large area of responsibility. And that's why, as a nation, we have become reliant on air power as a method of mitigating those challenges in scale. In the security sector, we have relied on air power to provide us with the flexibility necessary to cover a wide geographical area. Of course, coverage isn't the only advantage it provides us. It also gives Australia a level of responsiveness that can only be achieved by an aviation platform. Though it is important to understand that we can't achieve the required coverage and responsiveness by amassing great numbers of aviation platforms. It can only be achieved by creating an informed system that places the right assets in the right place at the right time. But even we know there are limitations on what we can achieve based on the resources available to us and the scale of our geographic area of responsibility. So, if aviation has given Australia the capability it needs to manage the scale of its geographic security responsibilities, why aren't we seeing the same advantages being exploited by our Pacific partners? To be blunt, air power for security purposes is simply too expensive for the majority of our Pacific partners, whose limited resources need to be prioritised on essential areas of national development. Even a basic, scaled-down version of our traditional Air Force model would be beyond the reach of most of our Pacific partners. While they may be able to afford a number of aviation platforms, the cost of building a security capability that includes training, operating, maintenance, safety, and logistics very quickly becomes prohibitively expensive. And as our shared international experience shows, you can't maintain an aviation capability efficiently and safely without ensuring that you have the basic building blocks to support it. So if the traditional Air Force model doesn't match the resources available to our Pacific partners, then what other options could they consider to achieve the security effect that they require? There is obviously the option to lease aviation capability from a commercial supplier. But as our own experience within the ADF demonstrates, that can be a cost-effective way of hiring a platform, but it isn't quite so cost-effective when you're trying to create a security outcome. The majority of platforms don't come equipped with specialist security equipment, so adding those increases costs significantly. As our current 5th generation experience demonstrates, the security outcome now tends to be less about the platform you're operating and more about the informed system you create to support it. Even the simplest of security tasks need some sort of queuing, tracking, and fusion to make the airborne element worthwhile. Once these costs are factored in, the commercial option can quickly become as prohibitively expensive as the traditional Air Force model. Some of our Pacific partners have explored using excess commercial capacity to provide a level of observation, But this tends to be very ad hoc, unreliable, and because the platforms aren't modified to conduct surveillance, the information gathered tends to be very limited in nature. So ultimately, we arrive at a conundrum, where our Pacific partners need aviation capability to create security outcomes over large distances and dispersed populations. But for the majority of them, this very real need remains out of reach because, as you would be aware, air power can be an expensive proposition that sets a high bar for entry, especially if you're trying to create a capability and not just operate a platform. So the question remains, how can our region, the Pacific region, benefit from the advantages of air power when national solutions place too much burden on most of the nation's available resources? One potential solution can find its regional imperative from the last meeting of the Pacific Island Forum in 2019. As part of that meeting's communique, the forum members stressed the ongoing importance of Pacific regionalism and stated that as part of securing our Blue Pacific, we should continue to emphasise the importance of genuine partnerships that reflect the collective priorities of the region. In a security sense, regionalism is about the ability to identify and agree security priorities, and then use the combined weight of national contributions to create a security effect where the sum is greater than that of the individual parts. Perhaps the best way to describe the realisation of this vision in an air power sense is to provide you a very real example of how a security effect can be created by regionalism. 40 years ago, in a regional response to a shared security concern over the sustainability of fisheries resources, our region established the Pacific Islands Forum's Fisheries Agency, or FFA. FFA is an advisory body providing expertise, technical assistance, and other support to its members who make sovereign decisions about their fisheries resources and who participate in regional decision-making on fisheries management. In 1994, the FFA established the Regional Fisheries Surveillance Centre, whose mission it is to support and assist FFA members to counter illegal fishing in the region. One of the Surveillance Centre's primary tasks is the provision of a reliable, analysed and risk-assessed regional surveillance picture which alerts members to the potential illegal fishing in their EEZ. In recent years, the capabilities of the FFA have been enhanced through the provision of an aerial surveillance element. As part of the wider Pacific Maritime Security Program, the Australian government has contracted 2 surveillance-equipped King Air aircraft to the FFA, designed to enhance the regional surveillance picture being provided to Pacific nations. The FFA, as an independent and trusted regional body, maintains MOUs with each individual nation to provide specific maritime security surveillance, which in turn adds to the overall regional security effect. In recognition of the unique service the FFA provides, in 2018, the Forum Foreign Ministers agreed to give the surveillance aircraft state-like aircraft status. While the aircraft were important to increase the security outcomes being delivered, it is essential to point out that to get full value out of their operation, the platforms needed to be enhanced by an in-country tasking mechanism, a fusion capability within the surveillance centre, and when possible, the aircraft are teamed with a response vessel, which is normally the nation's Pacific or Guardian-class patrol boat. With the regional approach that the FFA adopts, it allows it to take advantage of other regional organisations, like the Pacific Quadrilateral Defence Coordination Group, which is a group that includes Australia, New Zealand, the US and France, whose job it is to coordinate military maritime surveillance cooperation within the region, and who apply additional surveillance resources, both maritime and aviation, to FFA-run coordinated regional fisheries operations. This regional approach to maritime surveillance is providing real results for individual nations. Last year, the FFA coordinated activities which resulted in 397 vessels being boarded, which was a 43% increase from 2018. Perhaps the most important lesson we can take from the FFA example is that individually, the Pacific nations would probably not have the resources and capabilities necessary to deliver these security outcomes. But together, the region, working as a coordinated whole, was able to deliver a security outcome that benefited both the nations and the region. Regionalism by design, by operation, and by outcome. While the FFA model works, it's important to understand why and to look at some of the principles we can use to replicate it in other areas of regional security cooperation. First and foremost, it respects the sovereignty of participating nations. It doesn't seek to create a uniform security outcome. It simply enables national governments to use the provided support to achieve national aims. And in most cases, that also achieves a regional security outcome. The FFA is a trusted, independent regional body that isn't closely aligned with any particular nation or any particular political affiliation. It is purely focused on delivering a regional security outcome and can do that because those services are not coloured by international politics. Member nations are able to contribute based on the resources and the capabilities they have. Nations with limited resources aren't expected to contribute equally, but their participation alone does bring a whole of region benefit. Gaps in security frameworks caused by prohibitive cost of entry makes the whole system weaker. Whether a nation is a capability operator, a contributor, or a participant, the system needs to recognise the value of all levels of involvement. In the same way, we don't need to be too precious about nations with more resources and capabilities contributing to a greater degree. Security partners are aware of these relativities and expect more capable nations to step up when they are capable of doing so, recognising that we also get the benefit of creating a regional security effect. A satisfying regional security outcome can only be achieved if it is seen as responsive to changes in security priorities and in regional crisis. Any framework has to have the flexibility to surge when urgent security responses present themselves. In the last section of our talk today, I'd like to take you through a hypothetical example of how regionalism could be applied to other areas of security within the Pacific, and how air power could enhance the security effects being delivered. Unfortunately, in recent years, many of us in the Pacific region, Australia included, have experienced the adverse effects of severe tropical cyclones. Many of our partners recently suffered again at the hands of Tropical Cyclone Harold, and our thoughts and prayers go out to those who were affected. Though humanitarian and disaster relief is a whole-of-government effort led by DFAT, much of the immediate response, and in particular the provision of essential supplies through airlift, becomes the responsibility of regional military forces. While responses to natural disasters definitely have a regional flavour to them, with multiple nations contributing to the response, the actual mechanism by which this response is normally created still relies heavily on bilateral relationships, normally through a wider whole-of-government network that brings together responses from defence forces, NGOs, and other government departments. While you could conceive of a regional framework that could be built to respond to natural disasters, it might not be the easiest or the most natural place to start. In the first instance, it might actually be more productive to focus on preparation rather than response. How nations need to respond to a natural disaster tends to be extremely complex and changeable. So as a first step, perhaps regionalism could better focus on preparation. And because there are obviously multiple aspects of preparation to consider, and because, after all, this is supposed to be an air power forum, I thought I might further narrow the discussion to how a regional approach to airlift may deliver better security outcomes for individual nations and the region. As successive generations of airlift specialists continue to remind me, there is nothing easy about airlift. It is a complex system that needs to be managed carefully to achieve what appears to be a relatively easy effect. As with the maritime security effect created by the FFA, the regional effectiveness of airlift support to natural disasters could be improved if individual nations looked at opportunities to contribute to a wider regional security outcome. While not professing to be an airlift expert, there are many aspects of the task that could be enhanced to create greater efficiency within a regional system. This list of what could be done to create a more efficient regional airlift system is actually very long. But to give you a flavour of what it could include, in-country staff trained on determining AHDR supply priorities and aircraft tasking, the provision of airfield surveys to determine the full extent of potential operating aerodromes, and the ability to increase availability by doing minor works to austere airstrips. In-country staff trained to prepare loads and to assist in loading aircraft. The provision of specialist loading equipment, and an increase in the number of non-perishable AHDR supply caches distributed throughout the region. The effect we're trying to achieve is to build a more efficient regional response to disaster relief by increasing the region's capacity to task, stage, load, and distribute relief delivered by airlift. Increasing options and capacity within the system could create greater responsiveness and more targeted effects. As with the FFA model, individual nations within the region would contribute to the increased effectiveness of the security outcome based on the resources available and their capacity to do so. This should be considered a sliding scale, where on one extreme we have the countries capable of operating specialist airlift platforms, and on the other end of the scale we could have nations that contribute to the system simply by increasing their ability to accept aid delivered by air. Each of the Pacific nations could then choose where they lie on that scale and could be an important part of the system through operation, contribution, or by participation. Importantly, this approach respects the sovereignty of individual Pacific nations. The framework allows them to decide the when, who, and how humanitarian assistance is delivered. There is no requirement for them to use the system. It simply enables greater capacity for support if they choose to use it. Ultimately, the creation and management of this system could be managed by an independent body, much like that of the FFA, that coordinates national contributions and builds efficiency within the system. This independent organisation could at some stage also become a regional response capability as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, to try and wrap up the talk today in some sort of coherent conclusion. As a dependable security partner in our region, Australia needs to focus on those aspects of security that they have identified as their priorities. As identified by the Pacific Island Forums, their security priorities have a regional focus on non-traditional areas of security. These are complex and challenging problems, made all the more difficult by the scale of their geography and their limited resource base. To react to these security challenges, we should be considering embracing regionalism to enhance our ability to respond. In terms of air power contributing to this regional approach, we need to recognise that the traditional Air Force model won't enable the majority of Pacific nations, and we should be looking to a solution that allows them to take full advantage of air power's responsiveness and reach. This solution needs to enable our partners to make use of regional resources by participation in, or contribution to, a wider security model that allows them to benefit from air power, but doesn't require them to invest in every aspect of the capability. Regionalism by design, by operation, and by outcome. Thank you very much.